Imagine being told the war would last less than a week. Imagine a superpower announcing it had eliminated a nation's ability to fight back, that its nuclear facilities had been obliterated, its leadership decapitated, and its military broken. Imagine the victory speeches already written, the mission already half declared accomplished. Now imagine that same nation firing over 400 ballistic missiles and more than 1,000 drones at your bases, your allies, your cities, in wave after relentless wave, with some of those weapons slipping through the most sophisticated air defense systems money can ever buy. That is not a hypothetical. That is exactly what happened in the opening days of March 2026, and the world has not been the same since. This is the story of how Iran struck back, how a country under siege, its supreme leader killed, its nuclear sites bombed into rubble, still found a way to reach through the fire and land blows on the most powerful military on earth, and how those strikes forced every military strategist, every intelligence analyst, and every world leader to ask a question they are not sure they can answer. Can America actually stop what Iran is capable of doing? To understand what happened in those first terrifying days of March 2026, you have to go back to June 2025. That was when the fuse was lit. Israel, alarmed by intelligence showing Iran was enriching uranium to 60% purity and inching closer to weapons-grade material, launched Operation Rising Lion, a surprise strike campaign against Iran's most sensitive nuclear infrastructure. Within days, the United States followed. President Donald Trump authorized Operation Midnight Hammer, sending B-2 Spirit stealth bombers carrying the most powerful conventional bombs in the American arsenal, 14 GBU, 57A-B massive ordnance penetrators, each weighing over 30,000 pounds, plunging through the reinforced concrete ceilings of Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. Tomahawk cruise missiles, launched from submarines lurking silently beneath the surface of the Arabian Sea, added to the destruction. Trump declared the strikes had completely and totally obliterated Iran's nuclear program. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, appeared on state television days later and declared victory. A fragile ceasefire held through the summer of 2025. But underneath the surface, something dangerous was building. Iran had survived, and it had taken note of exactly where every American base in the region was located. By early 2026, the diplomacy that was supposed to prevent round two had collapsed entirely. Iran refused to surrender its nuclear ambitions. American and Israeli pressure intensified. Trump, in his State of the Union address in late February 2026, told the American people that Iran was working to build missiles that will soon reach the United States of America. Intelligence analysts were skeptical. The Defense Intelligence Agency's own 2025 assessment said an Iranian intercontinental ballistic missile was at least a decade away, but the rhetoric was already pulling both sides toward a cliff neither could step back from. On the morning of February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury. Strikes hit Tehran, military compounds, intelligence facilities, and the compound of the Supreme Leader himself. By Sunday morning, Iranian state television confirmed what many had feared and few had expected to happen so quickly. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was dead. But this is where things become more dangerous. Tehran did not pause to mourn. Within hours of the first American and Israeli bombs falling, Iran activated what it called Operation True Promise 4, a massive, coordinated, multi-directional retaliatory campaign unlike anything the region had seen before. The speed of Iran's response shocked American military planners. The 12-day war in June 2025 had given some in Washington the impression that Iran's first move would be tentative, carefully choreographed to limit escalation. That assumption was wrong. Ballistic missiles roared out of launch sites across western and central Iran. Shahed kamikaze drones, the same cheap, slow, lethal weapons that had terrorized Ukraine, were dispatched in swarms toward Gulf capitals. The targets were not limited to military installations. Qatar's Hamad International Airport, one of the busiest aviation hubs in the world, was targeted. Kuwait International Airport was struck. Dubai's port of Jebel Ali, one of the most important commercial shipping hubs on the planet, was hit. Smoke rose over the city that had made itself synonymous with modern prosperity and supposed immunity from Middle Eastern conflict. Qatar, which hosts Al Udeid Air Base, the largest American military installation in the entire Middle East, found itself at the center of the storm. On the first day alone, Qatar was targeted by 44 missiles and 8 drones. Its air defense networks worked frantically. Most were intercepted, but most is not all, and in the mathematics of missile warfare, the ones that get through are the ones that define the story. Explosions were heard in Doha. Smoke rose in the direction of Al Udeid. And then, on Monday morning, March 2nd, something unprecedented happened. Iran's Revolutionary Guard dispatched 2 Soviet-era Su-24 Fencer tactical bombers. Flying low beneath radar coverage, skimming just 100 feet above the surface, directly toward Al Udeid Air Base and the Ras Laffan natural gas facility. The planes were 2 minutes away from their targets when Qatari F-15 fighter jets scrambled and shot them down over the water. It was the Qatari Air Force's first ever air-to-air kill in combat. The Iranian crews are still unaccounted for, and Iran had just demonstrated it was willing to use manned aircraft in a region where America owns the skies. What happened next changed everything. On March 3, 2026, an Iranian ballistic missile slipped through Qatar's layered air defense systems and struck Al Udeid Air Base directly. No American soldiers were killed. The base had partially evacuated aircraft in the preceding days, satellite imagery showing the tarmac unusually empty, but the impact was undeniable. The missile hit America's forward headquarters in the Middle East, the nerve center of Central Command operations across the entire region, had taken a direct hit from an Iranian weapon. Buried in the reporting was a detail that caused alarm among defense analysts across the Western world. Among the damage was a strike that appeared to have targeted and damaged the AN/FPS-132 Block 5 upgraded early warning radar, a billion-dollar phased array system positioned near Al Udeid, capable of tracking ballistic missiles at ranges of up to 5,000 kilometers. This radar does not just protect Qatar. It feeds critical targeting data into THAAD and Patriot missile defense batteries spread across the Gulf. Damage to it meant the entire integrated air defense architecture of the region was operating with degraded vision. Iran had not just hit a building. Iran had poked out one of America's eyes. Meanwhile, in Kuwait, the situation turned deadly. An Iranian projectile, whether missile or drone remains disputed, evaded air defenses entirely and struck a makeshift operations compound at Shuaiba Port. 6 American service members were killed. The Pentagon confirmed the deaths at Dover Air Force Base, where President Trump joined the grieving families for the dignified transfer ceremony. The human cost of this conflict for America had become real. Across the Gulf, the scale of Iran's campaign was staggering. Kuwait's air defenses reported intercepting 97 ballistic missiles and 283 drones in just the first days. Bahrain's capital, Manama, where America's 5th Fleet is headquartered, was struck repeatedly. A Shahed drone hit an apartment building in the city. A 29-year-old Bahraini woman was killed. Children were among the dozens injured. The Bapco oil refinery near Mamir caught fire after 2 ballistic missiles hit it directly. On March 4th, a report emerged that crystallized just how relentless and organized Iran's campaign had become. The Islamic Resistance in Iraq, a coalition of Iranian-backed militias operating from Iraqi territory, announced it had conducted 29 separate operations using dozens of missiles and drones targeting American and Allied bases across the region. 29. Not one dramatic strike, not a single large barrage. 29 separate coordinated waves, each one probing defenses, exhausting interceptor stockpiles, and forcing air defense operators to make split-second decisions about which incoming threats to prioritize. It was not brute force alone, it was attrition. Deliberate, calculated, and deeply strategic. This is the part of the story that the victory speeches in Washington never accounted for. Modern missile defense systems are extraordinarily effective against individual threats. The American Patriot system, the THAAD battery, Israel's Iron Dome and Arrow systems, these are genuine marvels of engineering. Against a single ballistic missile, they perform at remarkable rates. But against 29 separate waves of mixed threats, ballistic missiles flying at hypersonic speeds, low-flying cruise missiles navigating terrain, swarms of cheap Shahed drones flying slowly and almost silently, the math begins to change. Each interceptor costs millions of dollars. Each Shahed drone costs less than $20,000. Iran has thousands of them. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth stood at the Pentagon podium and promised the conflict would not be endless. But the architecture of Iran's response was designed precisely to make it so. Iranian military doctrine, refined over decades of confrontation with far more powerful adversaries, is built on the principle of exhausting the enemy's will and its magazines simultaneously, make them fire their expensive interceptors at cheap drones, make them defend everywhere at once, make the cost of continuing the war higher for the attacker than for the defender. The effects were not contained to the battlefield. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply flows every single day, slowed to a near standstill. 150 freight ships, many of them oil tankers, sat motionless, their captains unwilling to sail through waters where Iran was actively threatening shipping. Qatar, which produces more liquefied natural gas than almost any nation on Earth, was forced to shut down its Ras Laffan gas liquefaction facility entirely. Analysts estimated it would take at least a month to return to normal production. Global energy markets shuddered. Russia and China watched all of this with extraordinary interest. Moscow, already deeply tied to Tehran through arms deals and space cooperation, has long dreamed of a scenario in which American military power is visibly stretched and visibly challenged. The spectacle of Iranian missiles hitting America's largest regional base was not something Russian state media was likely to ignore. China, meanwhile, has for years positioned itself as the alternative to American security guarantees in the Gulf. Every Arab government that watched Iranian missiles land in their capital cities while wondering how long their American protectors could sustain this fight was, consciously or not, recalibrating its long-term security calculations. Turkey deployed a Patriot missile battery to its Malatya province to protect the Kurichik NATO radar installation after Iranian missiles were tracked passing through Turkish airspace. 2 of them came close enough that Ankara summoned the Iranian ambassador in a fury. Iran's foreign minister denied any intent to target Turkey, suggesting instead, implausibly, that Israel had manufactured the incidents. NATO watched all of this from Brussels with deep unease. The alliance's Secretary General had, in a private message, praised Trump's decisive action in Iran. But now its member states were being caught in the blast radius of a war they had not voted for and could not control. Here is the uncomfortable truth that the opening chapter of this war forced the world to confront. The United States Air Force and Navy had struck nearly 5,500 targets inside Iran in the first 2 weeks of the conflict. Israel had destroyed more than 300 Iranian ballistic missile launchers, over 60% of Iran's operational launch capacity. Iranian ballistic missile launches were down roughly 90% from the peak of the first day, according to CENTCOM. By any traditional measure of military success, these numbers suggest overwhelming dominance. And yet, Iranian missiles were still landing at American bases, Iranian drones were still killing American soldiers, Iranian weapons were still reaching through the most sophisticated air defense networks ever assembled and finding their targets. The country whose supreme leader had just been killed, whose nuclear infrastructure had been turned to rubble, whose military command was being systematically dismantled from the air, that country was still fighting, and not just surviving, reaching. The Atlantic Council's analysts warned of something that the Trump administration appeared not to have fully accounted for. Iran perceives this as an existential conflict. For a regime fighting for its survival, there is no rational off-ramp that ends in submission. A ceasefire from Tehran's perspective is merely a pause before the next round. Iranian leadership calculated correctly that their country's willingness to absorb punishment and continue fighting was greater than America's willingness to sustain casualties, exhaust its missile defense stockpiles, and manage the political consequences at home and abroad for an indefinite period. Trump called it a short excursion. Iran answered with 29 waves. What we are witnessing is not simply a military campaign. It is a test of the most fundamental assumptions that have governed American power in the Middle East for a generation. The assumption that overwhelming air superiority guarantees rapid victory. The assumption that degrading a nation's military infrastructure ends its capacity to resist. The assumption that killing a regime's leadership decapitates its will to fight. Iran, in those first brutal days of March 2026, challenged every single one of those assumptions simultaneously. The new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, son of the man killed in the opening strike, was already in place within days, signaling that regime continuity was intact. The Houthis in Yemen, who had briefly observed a ceasefire, attacked a cargo ship in the Red Sea on March 7th. Hezbollah resumed rocket fire from southern Lebanon. The axis of resistance that American strategy had hoped to decapitate showed that it had multiple heads. The strategic consequences will take years to fully understand, but some things are already clear. The era in which America could threaten unilateral military action in the Middle East while its regional bases sat in comfortable safety is over. Iran has demonstrated in blood and fire and the wreckage of a billion-dollar radar array in Qatar that those bases are within reach. The interceptors designed to protect them are finite. The drones and missiles designed to overwhelm them are not. For every country in the region, from Riyadh to Abu Dhabi, from Manama to Doha, the lesson is existential in its own right. The American umbrella does not fully close. The missiles get through. And the choices made in the next months about diplomacy, deterrence, and the limits of military power will determine whether this conflict becomes a contained chapter in history or the opening act of something far larger and far harder to stop. The world told itself this would be short. Iran had other plans.